Esan tōko ingoa, no Pauwhakahaere for National Services Te Pairangi, or Head of Sector Development here at Papa. And yeah, I'll just start our hui with a karakia. Tēnei au, te hāpai nei, te tiri nei, te paupau nei, e tuku reo, mō tuku mana, tō tuku ihi, te matapihi, mauria, kia mau, kia ita, haumie, hui e, tai e. Lovely to see everyone.
Kia ora. Now, the topic today is of real kind of personal interest to me because once upon a time, I actually fancy myself as a self-made graphic designer. Several years ago, I was the comms lead for Forest and Bird's annual competition Bird of the Year. So I tasked myself with creating all number of campaign posters for our native birds. And I would basically just trawl over Flickr, looking for images with Creative Commons licensing, or rather CC BY licensing. And that gave me an incredible selection of pictures to kind of start my artistic kind of posters. So I love Creative Commons. And I was really excited when I joined kind of the museum scene about 3 years ago that museums are sharing and remixing their collections through competitions like GIF It Up. That said, I've come to discover that many directors and collection managers looking over their collection with a view to reuse, these things can kind of be put into the too hard basket, or it's way down their list of priorities. So this is what this session's all about. We're looking to demonstrate how museums have opened up their collections for reuse while also providing layers of protection within the Creative Commons licensing. And once this is done, how collections are shared across a variety of sites, from Flickr to Google Arts and Culture. First up though, some housekeeping. For those who have joined us, please keep yourself on mute while each speaker gives a 10 to 15 minute presentation. And after that, we'll go to the floor for questions. Given we're on Zoom, please direct your question to the speaker or indicate that it's a group question. Also, feel free to include any questions in on the chat. So first up for our session, we have Michael Wolf from the organisation Toa Toa Commons Aotearoa. Over to you, Michael.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Michael Wolf aho. It's a pleasure to be here talking about one of my favorite things in the world, which is Creative Commons licensing and copyright. So I am a lawyer by trade in the United States, and a copyright lawyer by specialty. So this is something that I might have more than the average amount of enthusiasm for, but I think I should be in good company this today, speaking with you all. So let me just share my screen here and see how that goes. All right. Is everyone seeing what I'm sharing? Should be a big white screen. Perfect. So I'm promising to be brief. I've managed to put together 40 slides on what should be a simple topic. So I'm taking something simple and I'm making it needlessly complex. And I'll start off with the caveat or the takeaway that I think this should be really, to some degree, quite simple, or the basic concepts involved are very simple. Some of the actual implementation of putting these concepts into practice can be considerably more complicated. And I think the following presentations from real world experiences, from real world institutions, will deal with some more of the difficulties. But in an ideal world, despite my making complex something that's simple, I want you to take away that this is something that should be at least readily understood and engaged with, that it's the whole point of the thing. So very quickly, right off the bat, what are we talking about when we say Creative Commons? So first and foremost, what we're talking about is a family of public copyright licenses. And I'll speak to that a little bit more in just a second. But we're also talking about an organization that's named Creative Commons, which is a nonprofit that originated in the United States, but is now actually a global organization of sorts that stewards these licenses. And The stewardship aspect is important, at least insofar as you know that when you use this, there is a group of people that employs lawyers all around the world to try and vet the licenses, the actual legal text of them, to make sure that they're doing what they're meant to do and that they do so in a way that's reliable. So all of that sort of continues under the scenes, but in general, you don't have to necessarily worry about Creative Commons, the organization. And we're going to focus today on the actual licenses and what they are, how they work, how you can use them. Okay, so public copyright license is, there we go. It's permission to use copyright protected work, and it's permission that's granted to the public at large. So a narrow license, and not public one, is me just saying to you, hey, I have something that's protected by copyright. I give you permission to use it. A public copyright license says to the world, hey world, you can use this thing that I control the rights to. Another way of understanding this is as an answer to the omnipresence of copyright in contemporary and digital life. And unfortunately, this means that we're gonna have to talk, or well, fortunately for me, maybe unfortunately for you, we're gonna have to spend just a moment talking about copyright law and why it poses such a barrier to certain kinds of just normal sharing, the sharing of creative work. That shouldn't, in theory, be too difficult. So what copyright is in one sense straightforward. I think everyone's mostly familiar with the general concept that it's a thing that exists, but it's a set of exclusive rights that come from law that govern creative works. And creative work should be construed basically as broadly as you can possibly imagine it. And I tried to put together a series of slides where different images of different kinds of creative things layered over one another, CDs, books, statues, paintings, computer code. And it got to the point where it was taking me far too long because there's just, the universe of things is so broad. It's not fixed in statute or by law. The things that copyright can protect are essentially limited only to the media that we can create to fix creative work in. So exclusive rights over creative work. So we don't need to dwell on it, but it's often referred to as a bundle of rights. So it's things like copying, issuing copies to the public, performing, playing, showing, communicating, doing stuff with creative work, usually in a way that implicates either making a copy or making a sale. So essentially a very broad suite of rights over a very broad collection of things. And the reason that this is omnipresent, as I said earlier, in a way that requires, or sometimes requires, people to intervene to make a public license, to give permission to the public generally, is that copyright applies automatically to everything that it touches. So the universe of things it touches is unbounded. It's all creative work, essentially all original works. And it applies to all original works automatically. So you'll see the circle C sometimes. This is the little copyright symbol. You don't need to put that on something to make it copyrighted. It's if it has been made in the period, essentially, well, getting into the dates can get complicated and fuzzy, but for anything that's modern, by law, it is protected. So not only is it protected, it's also protected for a very long time. So the current standard in New Zealand law is of the life of the author plus 50 additional years. And depending on the type of work we're talking about, that period that can be a little bit different. But the key thing is that the assumption is that not only is the term long, but it might not be immediately obvious just how long the term is, to the extent it's tolling from something like the life of a living person. So put another way, if we refer to Creative Commons licensing and things that are licensed under Creative Commons licenses as being open, as being available, and we want to make work available, or we have to intervene to make work available, because by default it's closed. The presumption is that you can't use it. So enter a Creative Commons license. It grants the public permission to use work, to do things with it, to translate it, adapt it, modify it, give it to others, to do that preemptively without having to have them ask. The Creative Commons licenses are, you know what? I thought I had missed a few slides, but I'm having some lag on my computer. Um, yeah, important. So even though copyright applies universally, that doesn't mean that there aren't situations where you can get away without asking somebody permission to use a copyrighted work. There are exceptions to copyright, and people who work in museums, who work in libraries, who work in those sectors will probably be familiar with at least some of these, the ones that apply immediately to them. But the important thing from a user perspective, thinking about the people who might visit your collections, is that copyright exceptions are actually quite narrow. And particularly in New Zealand, where there is not something that's like a general exception to copyright law, they're all cabined pretty discreetly, and they can be hard to use, and they can require going through certain steps and referring to the statute or the Copyright Act in a way that's not necessarily normal, unfortunately. So viewed through that lens, if you have a creative work, whatever it is, it's a painting on a wall, it's a song, anybody who wants to do something with it other than just enjoy it personally needs one of three things. They can work with permission from the copyright owner, they can use a legal exception if there is one that applies, or they can have confidence that the work just isn't protected by copyright, that it's so old it's in the public domain, or it's in the public domain for another reason. There's a few different ways things can end up there. So if you, as somebody who owns a copyrighted work, and you want people to use it, you want them to download it and put it on the computer, you want them to quote it, you want them to remix it, incorporate it into new works, copy it, learn from it in ways that are engaged and productive, well, that's where public licensing comes in, and that's where Creative Commons comes in. So Creative Commons is a suite of licenses. It's not just one. And you'll see these little symbols used and associated with them in association with the licenses, and we'll walk through them. Licensing is actually quite easy in one degree. If you want to give somebody permission, all you have to do is tell them they have permission. If you own a copyrighted work, you can put on the website, hey world, you have permission to use it. You don't necessarily need to rely on Creative Commons. But there's a reason why Creative Commons is the global standard, and that's that it's really been designed to be usable by everyone throughout the chain, and not everyone and robots, to facilitate the kinds of reuse that people using Creative Commons licenses want to see. So on the one hand, you have the legal code, you have the license, the thing that actually controls the relationship between the user and the copyrighted work. And it's like a 4 to 5 page long legal document. It is written in a way that is very crisp, clear, understandable to me as a lawyer, but it's not the type of thing that somebody looking to download a photo and make a poster for Bird of the Year. It's not necessarily what they want to scroll through. So on top of that, there's a human readable summary that reflects accurately, although minimally and maybe over simply, but accurately enough, the content of that legal code. So usually when you go to a Creative Commons license, you'll see just a quick page that says, hey, you can use this, but you need to give credit to the author, or you can use this, but only in a non-commercial way. And that's all the user really needs to know. And on top of that, and an added benefit that's hard to understate the importance of, is that these are machine readable. So if they're applied properly in the right circumstances, various platforms and products can pick up on the fact that this is a thing that has a Creative Commons license. So when Google is indexing your website for images, they can see the Creative Commons license. They can recognize that the image that it's attached to is something that people can use, and then allow people to filter for the license. So it's an extremely powerful tool for discoverability. The fact that the computer knows what the license is attached to. So with that, there's 4 license elements, which can be combined in different ways to make up to 6 licenses. I say 6-ish because there's a 7th. That's all, not really a license, or well, we'll get to it. The most basic. I can't see my clock. How am I doing on time? I want to just know how quickly I'm running through this. Sorry, 12:16. What? Okay. So I'll try to fly through this. CC BY, this is the most recommended, the thing that open advocates, people like me, want you to use. It has the most minimal restrictions there are. Basically, the rule is, if it has a CC BY license, you can use the work. You can use it for anything. You can use it in a commercial context. The only thing that's required is that the person using it needs to credit the author or the person that the author specifies, like an institution. This is fantastic. It's simple. It's clean. The share alike license takes something from from free software, like the computer software movement that that sort of sparked and inspired Creative Commons, which makes it viral. So that says if you want to use this thing in a creative new way, the new creative thing that you make has to also bear the same license. So this is restrictive in some sense, but it also ensures that future works that are made with your work are open. So I have a little bit of lag on my slides. I'm not sure if they're scrolling through here. The no derivatives works license restricts the user's ability to adapt it. So this is really quite restrictive. It means that they can share it with others, but they can't change it. So it's a pretty serious restriction on the universe of things that people can do, but are useful if in cases where the person granting the license is uncomfortable with the notion of the thing being changed, or uncomfortable with the possibility of how it might be changed in purposes that they don't, or to ends that they don't like. Still a bit of lag, so I'm missing a few of these. Okay, so there's a non-commercial restriction. It is what it sounds like. You can do whatever you like with the work, but however, you can't use it in a way that makes money. Essentially, the non-commercial is there's some interpretation difficulties. Then there are two combination licenses. So attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives. It is what it sounds like. You just stack those restrictions. Let's CC by NC and D. Attribution, non-commercial, share alike by NC SA. Pretty straightforward stuff. There's links in the slides to all of them. They're easy to find. Now, these are what the framework Creative Commons uses. These are some rights reserved licenses. There's just the core of things that people who are sharing might find important. But for a lot of people, for a lot of uses, you don't need to reserve any rights at all, and you can dedicate the thing to the public domain. And there's another piece of infrastructure that's extremely useful, that's worth considering, worth looking into. When I put my bird photos on Flickr, which is a thing that I do, and if I ever had a photo of a Kia used by Bird of the Year, it would make my year. But it's I release my photos under CC0 licenses to maximize reuse. So this doesn't essentially there are no restrictions under copyright. So no attribution requirement at all whatsoever. This is extremely useful in the museum context, and maybe we can talk about this in the question and answer segment, because there are instances where all you're trying to do as somebody who's making something available is disclaim ownership over something simple. So a common twist in the museum space is where a reproduction of a public domain work is being made, and you don't want to confuse users to say that, oh, we think that our reproduction or the act of making that reproduction gives us rights. A CC0 license is a good way of disclaiming any rights that may have accrued in that kind of act. So worth talking about later if we can get to it. All of this information is on the Creative Commons website. This is the global standard. So they're supported. Oops, I really wish my slides would. They're used from the institutions who are here today, who will be speaking. Also, everyone from the Met to the Rijksmuseum, in open access scientific journals. These are the licenses that are used. There are a few exceptions, but generally they're viewed as sort of bad outliers. This is the way to make work available. It's also now the standard for all Wikipedia articles, which also means it plays nice with Wikipedia. If you want your images to be reused on Wikipedia's platform, licensing them under Creative Commons is a fantastic way to see that done. Now, an important detail, and probably the last thing I'll say before I get off and get to the onto the more interesting stuff from the institutions who are actually putting this to work. Creative Commons is something that applying a Creative Commons license is something that a copyright owner does. And in many cases, institutions who own works will not necessarily be the copyright owners. So part of what you can do to make your collections open is really thinking through the question of what is it that we as an institution actually own and control, and how do we communicate the right status of our works to our users? There's another tool for just communicating rights status. It's actually related to Creative Commons. A lot of the same people are involved. It's called rightstatements.org. I'm not going to talk about it here other than to flag its existence, because it is important. They provide little symbols that look like this that communicate other kinds of information about the underlying status or right status of works. I was tasked with talking about the benefits of open sharing, and to be honest, I want to just leave you with one simple thought. There are lots of quantifiable ways, like lots of institutions have metrics about here's how people engaged with an image when we charged for it, and here's the type of amazing reuse that we see when we opened it up. And it's just night and day. The figures don't even compare. And I think it'll be probably more fun to hear those kinds of stories from the actual institutions. Know that it's quantifiable, but I think the most important thought I want you to take away from this is that you can't predict what people will do when they're given permission. So if you're coming from a place where the default is closed and people believe that they cannot interact with what you're sharing to the world, then the way that they interact with your collections will be limited. If you open it up, the things that are done will surprise you. And happy to talk about that more in Q&A, but that'll be my closing thought. And this slide is not at all important. It's just for the deck when it gets released later. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, I learned a lot, especially I didn't even realize Creative Commons was machine readable. So yeah, you can see how it can be that much more discoverable. Yeah. So the next speaker we have is somebody I know quite well because I worked with him at Tamaki Paenga Hira, Auckland Museum. That's James Taylor. And he is the Collections Information Manager. And they've been sharing their collection across lots of platforms. So I'll get James to speak to that.
Okay, thanks, Mandy, and thanks for joining us today, everybody. So I'll just get my notes out here. So kia ora koutou, katoa, ko James Taylor taku ingoa. As Mandy said, I'm the Online Collections Information and Partnership Manager at Tamaki Paenga Hira, Auckland War Memorial Museum. So my job, I look after our collections online, and I also look after the various partnerships where we share our open data and our open imagery out across the internet. So this afternoon I'm going to talk to you about how we use Creative Commons licenses as part of our open collections to enable use and reuse, and how we then push those onto various partner websites to massively expand the reach of our collection. So I'm part of the Collection Information and Access team at the museum who looks after various forms of access to the museum's collections. And I just want to acknowledge the work that I'm talking about today is a combination of many years hard work, and also just want to shout out to my colleagues who do the hard slog around copyright. I get to sit here and do a presentation like this while they're dealing with inquiries and putting the licenses on objects and all the rest of it, and also to our imaging team who create the amazing photography that we can make accessible to users all around the world. The other thing to note is that this work is sort of done across the museum, so it's work that is applied across the entire collections and research group. So just to begin, a little bit of context. In 2015, Auckland Museum launched its new collections online, and a key part of this was a really simple rule, but a really important rule for us, which is that the museum's digital collections should be open by default and closed by exception, sort of pointing a little bit to what Michael was talking about. So as a publicly funded institution, we should make our collection data and our collection imagery as accessible as possible to the public, that pays our salaries and that pays for the museum to work. And that we should really only close off access to collections unless there are good reasons, which I'll touch on shortly. So there were sort of four key parts to this. The first part is around open collections. So Auckland Museum was the first New Zealand organisation to adopt a CC BY licence as default. So we can provide this open access to our collection data and imagery. But it's really important to note, and I think particularly for institutions that are wary of Creative Commons licensing, that we balance this desire to share and to make our collections open with some protections, particularly for our Taonga Māori and Pacifica collections. So we have a very detailed cultural permissions policy, which is guided by a couple of the museum's key documents, which is Hikarahi Māori and the Tuliwa, which cover the Māori dimension at Auckland Museum and the Pacific dimension at Auckland Museum. And what this essentially means is that any images that depict Māori or Pacific people, subjects or content are captured by our cultural permissions policy, and users can't download this content. Instead, users are directed to inquire with us about their reuse. So I think that kind of just touches on something that while we try to make the vast majority of our collection open and reusable and accessible, not everything is available to be shared, and we can kind of cover off some parts of our collection. We also have a custom filtering system within our collection management system. So there are some other parts of collection data that we don't share with the public. So for example, we don't share the field collection location of endangered species, for instance. So we have this open access policy, but we can still can kind of protect parts of the collection. But the really important thing is really that point number 4, and what Creative Commons allows us to do. It allows us to encourage the use and the reuse of our collections. Users can hook into our data with an API, and also we make full resolution photography available of the CC BY images through our collections online, so there's no charge for accessing any of our collection photography. And the important point, I guess, is that the Creative Commons licenses give us this huge base and the confidence to do a lot of the work that we do around making our collections more accessible and more available. And it also means that we can spend, the time that we need to spend on the collections that require more care, and our obligations to communities that require more care around their collections. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about our open access journey, my colleagues Victoria and Zoe took over the Open Glam Twitter account a year or so ago, and then wrote up their tweet storm as a couple of Medium articles. So that sort of goes through the open access journey and also the cultural permissions in more detail. And it also talks about where we kind of see things heading in terms of open access. I've also put together a Google document that will be linked at the end of the slides, so that with some more links and some more reading if you're interested. So how does this work in practice? So this on the screen here is a copy of an extract from our copyright licensing guide. We predominantly use the CC BY license over our collection imagery. So as you can see there, it applies to images that are out of copyright objects and to objects that the museum is the copyright owner for. And then that's on the other side of the screen there is our permission agreement that is given to donors. And so we ask donors whether they would like to sign up for Creative Commons license when they're donating material to the museum, and about 25% of them do. So what that means is that even material that is in copyright can still have a can still have a Creative Commons license on top of it. We do also use Creative Commons non-commercial, particularly for kind of contemporary artists. That's something that they all ask for rather than the full CC BY licensing. And we are looking at integrating the full suite in the next year or so we can capture some of the outliers that don't really fit within the CC BY licensing. The other point to mention, again, picking up something that Michael did, as part of opening up our collections, we did do some very, some big auditing projects around, auditing our collections, checking what we hold copyright to, and checking what material could be made available under the Creative Commons licenses. So this slide really just shows the sort of the net result of 5 or 6 years of our open access project. So the museum has just under 1 million records available on collections online, 700,000 or so images, and about 400,000 of those are openly licensed images. And that's a small chart showing the growth of each of those over the last couple of years. And it stays at a pretty sort of steady, about 2/3 of the collection imagery that we have is available to use openly. And we're adding roughly 15 to 20,000 open images a year. But as you can see, with sort of 400,000 open images, we've got a really large base to do some interesting stuff with in terms of how we use this open collection and share it on partner websites to make it more accessible and to make it more reusable. And this is basically the work that we do around partnerships. So we share our collection imagery and our collection data with over 20 different collection partners. This ranges from aggregators to research portals to curated platforms. And what it does is it just enables us to massively expand the reach of the museum's collections. And it is these Creative Commons licenses that enable us to do this. I'm going to be talking at the Digital Collection Summit on the 6th of October, and I'll get into a bit more detail about the partnerships as a whole. So I'd encourage you to sign up for that. But I will just briefly go over some of this work. I don't have a big numbers chart today, but just to illustrate what this does mean for our access. So collections online, we get about 550,000 views over the course of the last financial year. Using these partnerships, we have had 55 million views of our collection images in the last financial year. And so that is a 10,000% increase over what we can do on our own collections online. So it is a massive jump, and it's, yeah, as I said, it's these Creative Commons licenses that enable this massive access and this sort of amplification of our collections across the internet. So just a few examples of some of the websites that we share content with. So this is the sort of the aggregators and the research portals. So these platforms take our data either via our API or via bulk uploads. So a couple of New Zealand ones here. Digital New Zealand, really important partner, and Digital Pacific is a partner that's come on board in the last year or so, who we share our Pacific collection material with, and then a couple of the big natural science aggregators, so the Atlas of Living Australia and GBIF as well. So that's where a lot of biodiversity research is done. And then we also have content on platforms that are a bit more curated. So this is an example of a handbag from our Carried Away exhibition from a couple of years ago. So there you can see it on our Collections Online, or the Collections Online record. It's also available to view on Google Arts and Culture. It's available to view on Pinterest, and it's available to view on Flickr as well. So what this means is that basically, we don't expect users to come to the Auckland Museum website and to our Collections Online to find our content. If you're a user on Pinterest or a user on Flickr and you're interested in a particular fashion designer, particular era of fashion, or, birds, we have lots of natural science specimens up there as well. You can search for those on the platforms that you're using, and you'll actually find that content there. Yeah, the other thing with these platforms is that we can use some of the features that they offer in some quite interesting ways as well, which I'll share with you shortly. So that's all well and good. How do the users actually use and reuse this content? Now, I'll have to admit, it can be a little bit tricky to kind of track how people are using the open content. At the end of the day, if you want to go down this open access route, you have to be comfortable to a certain extent that you are letting go of the content and people are going to make whatever use that they want of it. But I do have a few examples from the last lockdown. So Siobhan Leachman has used our open data and a bunch of other institutions to kind of come up with these Wikidata graphs, which show how Charles Heafy's work is sort of interrelated. One of the really interesting things in the last 18 months or so is we've had a lot of feedback coming in from from users in the United States, particularly science students in the US, saying that it's awesome that we have our specimen sheets available online because they're locked out of their labs, but they can go online and they can find these specimen sheets either on GBIF or on our own collections online. The other one up there is an email around how a species of plant was identified via a specimen that was uploaded to GBIF that was identified on Pitcairn Island. And then the bottom corner is the way in which someone's reused some of our natural science photography to create some artwork. The one example, and again, Wikipedia was mentioned. I know we do want to do a bit of a deep dive into Wikipedia. So again, as Michael mentioned, what we can do because of the CC BY licenses, we can make our content available on Wikimedia, which can then be made, which then means that it's available for reuse via by editors on Wikipedia. So we have about 170,000 images that have been uploaded to Wikimedia. That was all done by volunteers, by Wikipedia volunteers. And then this content can be reused by Wikipedia editors in all sorts of ways, and it really surfaces our collections in ways that we never would on the museum floor, absolutely never would on the museum floor. It also surfaces our collections to a global multilingual audience. So just some examples of some of the content. So the Treaty of Versailles is one of the earliest images that we uploaded to Wikimedia. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second, but because Wikipedia content is linked to Google info boxes, the first thing that people see when they search the Treaty of Versailles is actually a cover of that from the Auckland Museum collection. We have content that illustrates army uniforms. We have content that illustrates New Zealand politicians. We have content that illustrates glass bottles, for instance. So there's really diverse, incredible use of our content on Wikipedia. The Treaty of Versailles is used on 98 different pages on Wikipedia in a broad range of languages. We have content on 5,000 Wikipedia pages now on 140 languages. So again, that's that multilingual reach. The images don't require English text to go with them. What's really interesting is that our human history and natural science collections are used actually most across the pages, apart from that the Treaty of Versailles. English Wiki accounts for about 17% of the total page usage, but for around 60% of the views that the content gets. And there's some really interesting uses, as I said. So, for example, our applied arts collection, which is part of the human history collection, is actually used in a number of Wikipedia articles about business history because it's specimens, or it's not specimens, it's examples of, things that these companies have made, and we have made that content available. So used as examples of companies and makers. And the content is also used for articles about geography, about people, about places, about science, and about technology as well. As I mentioned, one of the really important things about Wikipedia these days is the way in which Wikipedia information is hooked into the Google Knowledge Graph. So what that means is not only is our content available on Wikipedia itself, but it's also available to the global internet and to that huge audience that uses Google every day. So these are some examples of some of the content that appears searching different people and different concepts. So the Treaty of Versailles I've mentioned, biographical information, and then some really random stuff like rags to riches. That rags to riches ball is from our collection, and that illustrates that saying. So look, just before I wanted to wrap up, I do also want to mention that we can also, as an institution, make use of some of the features of the platforms that we put our open collections onto. So in the last COVID lockdown here in New Zealand last year, we actually hooked into the Flickr API and used that to pull our own imagery out for a Google Chrome extension. So you can download this Auckland Museum Chrome extension from the Google Chrome Web Store, install it, and you are met with this beautiful high resolution collection photography when you open a new tab. And so what that is really is it's another way and it's another place that people can engage with our open collections. And just the final example, the current COVID lockdown, where we're kind of getting into 4 weeks now. So a call for that went out at the start of the lockdown for work for visitor hosts who obviously can't get into the museum and don't necessarily have a lot of work that they can do from home. So what we have done is set up some Wikipedia campaigns using a tool called the ISA tool. And essentially what that means is that we can hook into our content that's been uploaded to Wikipedia, and it's this platform that allows people to go in and to tag the images with concepts from Wikidata. So our visitor hosts and some volunteers are doing this work, tagging our Wikimedia images, which makes the content more available and easier to find on Wikimedia, but we're also looking at ways in which we can bring that data into our own collections online, so a bit of data round tripping. And that screenshots from the dashboard that I set up, and so far the volunteers in the 4 and a bit weeks or so that we've been working on have added 15,000 tags to our content. So again, it's a way that we can use this content that's available on other platforms to provide meaningful work for our staff that are locked out of the museum, but it also means that we can make the content even more accessible and even more reusable, both on our own collections online and also on Wikipedia. So that was just a quick overview from me this afternoon, but just want to reiterate that Creative Commons is a huge part of what enables us to do our work around partnerships, and it makes our collections more accessible for creativity and for users undertaking research. It exposes our collections to a global audience and to a massive multilingual audience as well. And it also allows us as an institution to experiment, to try things out. And yet while we do that, we can still actually protect with our cultural permissions policy, for example, we can still protect the collections that require more care and that we're not comfortable with people with sharing and with people sort of openly reusing. Look, I'm always happy to discuss anything that I've talked about today. So there's my email address. And so please do get in touch if you'd like to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That's awesome. Wow. Was it 55 million views? Really demonstrates the power of this kind of licensing, I reckon. Totally. Yeah, incredible. So the next speaker we have is Rights Manager Katrina McPherson, and she'll demonstrate how Creative Commons has been used to date by Te Papa.
Kia ora koutou. I will just share my screen, if this is going to work. There we are. Kia ora koutou, ko Katrina McPherson toku ingoa. I'm Katrina, and as Mandy kindly said, I am the Rights Manager here at Te Papa. My role is actually responsible for ensuring Te Papa is well placed to achieve effective use, reuse, repurposing and re-imaging of Te Papa's content, as well as leading the management of intellectual property, providing advice to Te Papa in the sector, and managing a team of 2. So we have within the rights team a media and image researcher and a rights officer. I've been at Te Papa for the last 11 years and in the rights team for the last 6, and my current role for just over a year. Right, before I launch into how Te Papa actually uses Creative Commons licenses, I thought it would be worth just briefly touching on the New Zealand Open Access Government Licensing Framework, that is a mouthful, and Te Papa's relationship with NZ Goal. So NZ Goal was approved by Cabinet in 2010 and provides a framework for releasing government copyright material. It adopts and advocates for the use of Creative Commons licenses for a few reasons, mainly that Creative Commons licenses are free, simple, and standardized. And that's what we love about them. Now, Te Papa is an autonomous Crown entity, which is linked to the government. We use NZ Goal to guide our decision-making process around open access, and we try to follow these recommendations where possible and practical. So Te Papa was a pretty early adopter of Creative Commons licensing, applying our first license to audio podcasts for our Reader Angus exhibition back in 2008. And this proved that it not only worked for our own purposes in the exhibition and online, but also ensured easy reuse of the content when the exhibition went on to tour across New Zealand. We immediately saw benefits of not having to relicense the content multiple times and to multiple organisations. The rest of the timeline here will give you a bit of an overview of some of our major milestones Te Papa's reached in terms of using Creative Commons, which we'll dive into in a little bit. So before I cover where Te Papa applies Creative Commons licenses, I should mention that Te Papa is a great user of others' Creative Commons licensed content, from blogs to exhibitions, digital products to presentations. We cover a lot in our in-house copyright training on how to use and where to find Creative Commons licenses, because it means our kaimahi know upfront what they can use the content for, and they don't have to come back and check with me. Always a bonus. So how and where does Te Papa apply Creative Commons licenses? From as early as 2013, Te Papa started releasing our documents under Creative Commons. And this started with some more of our administrative documents, things like annual reports, our statement of intent and statement of performance expectations were all released under CC BY. But this soon led to other documents and design files, such as our wonderful National Services to Paerangi sector resources. We started with the copyright and museums, so if you need some extra help on copyright, go and check that one out, and have now committed to releasing our new editions under a Creative Commons license. In 2017, we started creating activity books. For Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori that year, we released our Te Reo Māori activity book under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial or CC BY NC license. This allowed teachers, parents, tamariki to download and print and also adapt our resources for use at home and schools, providing they weren't using the books commercially. We've had such a great response to this. Te Papa's gone on to actually create further activity books, and they're all released under the same Creative Commons license. Oh, we went too far. There we are. We also like to react to situations and requests. So last year, like most of you, we were all faced with how the museum was going to operate under the COVID-19 alert levels. And Te Papa wanted to maintain our usual standards for signage while ensuring we met with the government guidelines and remain consistent for our visitors by using the covid19.govt posters, design files, icons, messaging and colours, love the yellow, which were handily released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial licence. We were able to develop bilingual museum-specific signage, which we could use to ensure our visitors would know what to do when they came back into the building. We soon realised the potential for other GLAM institutions to also benefit from the signage, especially for those that don't have in-house design, writing or te reo translation. And we released our versions of the signs under a Creative Commons Attribution licence in easy to print formats. But it's not just our documents which we found more beneficial to openly release. We started looking at other creative content. Te Papa creates a whole lot of content. And we wanted to openly release this. So we looked at our data sets. Te Papa had previously provided sections of these data sets freely and on request to researchers, and we anticipated that these requests would continue and releasing the data sets openly would reduce staff time in servicing the requests. There were also a limited amount of prospects in selling or licensing. So Te Papa uses both data.govt.nz and our own websites to release our data sets. And we started in 2017 with the collections online download survey data and the Clenso specimen data and the seabirds data. Now the latter, the @seabirds observation of seabirds data, again another mouthful, was recorded using guidelines from the Australasian seabird mapping scheme and counts seabirds seen from ships during a 10-minute period. Releasing this data set for open reuse has enhanced Te Papa's standing as a scientific research institute and helps government agencies in the natural resource sector manage and protect seabirds. And as a temporal-based data set, it provides comparison for new observation programs in the future. Then in 2018, we released our collections API data. A publicly available API for collections data had been a long-term strategic goal for Te Papa because of the opportunities it brought for efficiency in the outputs for staff and contractors, and also the ability to contribute to non-Te Papa projects without committing any staff resource. Opening our structured collection data for reuse also enabled easier access for the data for those wishing to build cool new ways to engage with our collections. And most recently in 2020, with the assistance of the Smithsonian Transcription Centre, we released the William Oldham Business Records. These were a great example of a collaboration with another GLAM institution. And Te Papa digitised the record books from our collection, sent the images to the Smithsonian for transcription, who then provided us with copies of the data. The ethnographic specimen with a provenance to Oldman's business can be found across various public institutions across the world, including Te Papa, the Brooklyn Museum, the British Museum, and the National Museum of the American Indian. And this data will be useful in establishing and confirming provenance for these collections. But by far, our biggest use of Creative Commons licensing, just like Auckland Museum, is in collections online. So in June 2014, Te Papa released 30,000 images, high resolution images for download via our collections online. And these were either marked up with a Creative Commons license or as no known copyright restrictions. Our main goal was to make it as easy and clear as possible for our visitors to know how and which images they could use and which were still restricted. So we kind of adopted a simplified traffic light symbol. All rights reserved became our default as red. These were images you couldn't use without seeking permission from Te Papa, and it covered works that remained in copyright, had donor, privacy, moral or cultural rights to consider. And given the lack of Indigenous rights protection under New Zealand legislation, Te Papa decided that all Mātauranga Māori content would remain as all rights reserved, regardless of its copyright status. Our Amber content was released under a Creative Commons license, the CC BY NCND, and this license was applied to digital surrogates where Te Papa was the sole rights holder. This covered our scientific specimen and also our out-of-copyright three-dimensional works from history, art, and the Pacific. And then lastly, we applied no known copyright statements to green. This was content where there was no copyright existing in either the digital surrogate or in the original work. And these could be used for absolutely anything, including commercial uses. You may ask, why did we initially adopt the Creative Commons attribution non-commercial no derivatives license, which we've heard is quite the restrictive one? At the time, Te Papa still has and still does have an active media sales and licensing business, which drives some revenue for Te Papa, and we wanted to protect that. We also wanted to adhere to any moral rights which may still exist in those works, but we are open to moving towards a more open license and certainly have in some situations. Oh, go back. There we are. So our initial launch of 30,000 images, we've actually continued to release more every year. So by 2015, we had 45,000 images available. In 2017, we were up to 65,000. And we now are sitting around 100,000 images available for download. We're continuing to release more monthly as we digitize, assess, and license content. And then in 2020, as part of our statement of performance expectations, which is the document that Te Papa reflects our proposed performance targets and forecasts to our government, we started reporting back on our download numbers. This really aligned with Te Papa's idea to reach beyond our four walls and see how our online collections could also influence our audiences. And in order to increase more opportunities to download that content, we looked at that original Creative Commons license and began to weigh up some of those benefits of going more open. And an area where this was seen to be most beneficial was actually our scientific specimen, which we've decided and have now released under a Creative Commons BY license. The Creative Commons BY license enables greater and enhanced audience participation and enhanced engagement with the images. Citizen scientists and creatives were already sourcing images from historic photography in our art collections, and we're really likely to use the images in crowdsourcing sites such as iNaturalist, Science Exchange, Nature Watch NZ, and as we've heard, Wikipedia and Wikimedia. And some of this use had been prohibited under our previous Creative Commons license. But for Te Papa to actually action these changes, we needed to make some upgrades to EMU, our collection management software, and also collections online. And at that time, we decided instead of just adding CC BY as an option, we would add the full suite of 7 copyright Creative Commons licenses, giving us a little bit more freedom in the future. So the future. What is in store for Te Papa's future with Creative Commons? Te Papa's, or probably more my next big steps, are actually ensuring the full suite of Creative Commons licenses are an option for our external copyright holders for when we start to negotiate copyright licenses for the museum use. Our current licensing approach is to offer a non-commercial museum use license, which gives us as Te Papa reuse of the images, but doesn't allow reuse by our audience, which we see as a missed opportunity. We really we're looking at reviewing our licenses, adding the Creative Commons options, but we do need to do some testing with specific collection areas first. So we'll be starting that work in early 2020. You can probably see from the timeline of Creative Commons use, we started off small, adopting the use in a few small areas, and then we watched it grow. The use and implementation of Creative Commons licenses grow and filter across the organisation. People generally become more comfortable the more people are using Creative Commons. I hope this gives you a bit of an idea of how we've used Creative Commons, and not just around the collection, but probably some of those things that all organisations are actually using, and perhaps could share more openly, even if it is just your annual report. Thanks so much. Ngā mihi nui.
Awesome, thank you, Katrina. That's great. It warms my heart that yeah, our seabirds and our natural sciences have really benefited from Creative Commons licensing. I didn't realise that was the case. Those data sets. It's yeah, it's awesome. Hey, we're close to finishing. We've only got 4 minutes left, but potentially the speakers might be happy to do a few more minutes if you just give me a thumbs up to say yes. We're going to take it to the floor now. Does anybody have any questions for our speakers?
I've got a quick question, and it's just around probably any one of the speakers could answer it, but it's around creating the completely sort of open, no restrictions license. If you've got an image that was taken in a public space, but it includes, say, an image of a person, are you allowed to attribute that in that way with just like an open access? So like you own the image, you took it, but it includes an image of a person, but it was taken in a public space. What would be the approach there? Actually, probably that's one for you, Mike.
I think one of the important, so the way the law would look at it is you're the photographer, and from a copyright perspective, the subject of the image in most circumstances won't have a copyright interest in the image. So as the author, you can license it how you want as the author owner. That said, I think, and we touched on this a little bit when talking about Mātauranga Maori and Indigenous rights. There are many ways in which images or items that could be openly licensed have sensitivities that are not just copyright issues. So if there's an item in your collections which has which you have the rights to, but might pose, for instance, like a potential privacy problem. But privacy rights exist independently. There might need independent privacy consideration. And anytime that there's a sort of a non-copyright issue identified, that's something that should be taken seriously and thought through. So I don't think it doesn't restrict your ability in this instance, in that example, to license it with a Creative Commons license, but it might affect how you think about whether or not you would or should.
I'll just jump in quickly as well. Sorry, yeah. Victoria.
No, go.
Just to speak from the kind of privacy element of it, especially if this was coming from a museum wanting to take photos of its visitors or wanting to take photos in its location. You did mention that it was in a public space. Public spaces do not include even public buildings, like we see Te Papa as being a public space. Any photos taken within Te Papa need to have permission, or at least we need to indicate that we're doing so. So we use signage in that way. If it was just a photo out on the street, then no privacy actually applies in that situation. But it is worth just double checking with the Privacy Act if you are concerned.
Cool, thank you. And I did have another one, which was just around, you know, the Y262 claim, which, you know, is that consideration of flora and fauna from, I guess, you know, copyright protection and consideration from a cultural perspective. And I was wondering whether, James, you would be able to comment on that use and reuse licensing of some of the natural history content, and does it consider that from a cultural restrictions perspective?
So that's a very good question, actually. So originally when we released our open images, like a large percentage of those are the natural science specimens, because there's no copyright per se in those specimens. Obviously, though, there are Indigenous considerations to take into account. In 2015, when the kind of open access project was launched, Y262, you know, was still sort of sitting there being debated, so it hadn't really come to the forefront yet. What we are doing is looking at traditional knowledge labels potentially as a way of dealing with some of the natural science specimens. Obviously, our cultural permissions policy would cover specimens as well. We have a couple of big research projects where we're actually working with local iwi, our rangitahua and our Noises projects, and so we will be using those to sort of pilot our work in this area. But yeah, that's certainly something that's on the cards at the moment for us, is kind of a re-examination of that, what the consequences of Y262 are. Obviously there's a copyright review happening at the moment, and there's also you know, questions around Indigenous data sovereignty that I think that we need to start taking a bit more seriously as well as a sector. So yeah, so there's a bunch of work that we'll be doing over the coming years to kind of look at that in a bit more detail.
I have a question for James, if I can.
Sure.
James, when you've and the team have been opening up to that much wider ecosystem, what are the techniques in general terms that you've been using to track that in terms of numbers and use? I imagine there's a whole complexity around that.
Yeah, totally.
And that's a potential barrier for us and smaller organizations of being able to report accurately to stakeholders.
Yeah, and you know, like I'll be honest with you, the monthly reporting is a very large Google document that has a whole bunch of spreadsheets in it that kind of combine into to give one number at the end. So what's interesting is obviously we have Google Analytics for our own collections online, but we can't necessarily get Google Analytics for other platforms. So some of those platforms, like the more social media ones, like the Pinterest, the Flickrs, and Google Arts and Cultures, will have that sort of analytics baked into it, because, you know, that's their bread and butter. So you can go on and grab those numbers and that's not too problematic. With Wikipedia, there is reporting, but it's basically done on a sort of monthly basis. Like, you have to get the numbers at the end of each month, because otherwise they get changed, and it changes, and it's a bit complicated, but you have to do it every month. And we've actually just been having this discussion with our auditors, who've been a bit perplexed by the whole thing. So you can get the numbers from Wikipedia. Digital New Zealand provides some basic kind of view and engagement numbers. And yeah, so you kind of grab the stuff that you can. So when I use 55 million as a number, that's not made up. I mean, that's a number that has been counted over the course of the last financial year, but it's from the platforms that offer us the views and the engagement. So for example, GBIF, even though it's a really important research portal for us, and we can do some other really interesting stuff with it in terms of measuring research impact, we don't actually get any analytics from them at all. So yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm happy to share an example of the spreadsheet that I use basically to do it, but it is just every month do that reporting and combine it at the end of the year basically. So yeah, it's not particularly high tech, unfortunately, but yeah, I think it does give an indication. And you know, you can't necessarily, it's not easy to track the way that people are using the content because of that CC BY license. They don't have to ask permission from you, but you know, from our mind, having that material available in so many places, just it means that it's going to get used, and we can kind of still tell some stories and tell some narratives to, to senior leadership and to our funders, the Auckland Council, around what the benefit of this, of this project is as a whole. And I think that benefit is around opening up, the collections that we hold and care for the people of New Zealand.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. I think we're running a bit short on time now. We're 5 past, and yeah, you guys have been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and all the incredible projects that you're doing, yeah, to open up collections and all variety of things. Now, after this session, I'll send out an email with a recording of the session itself. We can send it through the PowerPoints as well. And if you have any kind of specific questions for the speakers, I'm happy to kind of follow up on that as well. Yeah, so thank you all for your time. Give a wave to the speakers, and yeah, I'll be in touch.
Kia ora, thank you.